Hello everybody and welcome to another video on the channel. The Pro Tour just happened this past weekend. Congratulations to Jake Beardsley for taking it all down with Rakdos. I'm not going to call it Evoke, but you can let me know in the comment section down below what you want to call this deck. But Jake Beardsley took it down with Rakdos Scam, and with the completion of the Pro Tour, that means that we're going to have a ban announcement, a scheduled ban announcement. I know WotC somewhat recently kind of described to us that they would have a scheduled rotating, approach to doing the ban list and things like that. So this is going to be kind of their first scheduled ban list announcement, and the question on everybody's mind: what's going to get banned? What are the changes that are going to happen to the primary formats, which we're going to be just focusing on Modern and Pioneer today. As of the time of recording this, I'm not 100% convinced that anything is or needs to be banned from either format. However, that's kind of why I wanted to make this video. I wanted to go ahead and discuss what my thoughts are on some of the more controversial cards. We had a lot of discussion on specifically the One Ring going into the Pro Tour, so I wanted to give you guys my thoughts on how I felt about that after watching the Pro Tour over the weekend, and we're going to dabble a little bit in Pioneer as well. So let's get started with the first card. We can't have a ban list discussion video without first discussing the elephant in the room, and that is the card you see in front of you, the One Ring. If memory serves, this was actually one of the cards that was spoiled the earliest throughout the spoiler season for Lord of the Rings, and a lot of people kind of brushed it off, maybe discussed it as Commander staple or something that you would want to play in your casual group, potentially Legacy and Vintage applications as well. I don't really think that anybody realized how powerful it was going to be in the Modern format, with the exception of Aspiring Spike, of course, because he is an incredibly smart person who was kind of on this card from the get-go. Now, I will say, after watching this card play out in, ring versus ring matchups, ring versus non-ring matchups over the course of the Pro Tour weekend, and playing with the card, albeit probably a little bit too much myself, over the past couple of weeks in preparations for the Pro Tour, I have to say that, one, yes, the card is exceptionally powerful. The arguments for banning it would be the card is, the game is entirely about the ring once it enters the battlefield, where you get the protection. It essentially buys you that one turn, because typically with powerful card advantage type 4 drops like this, you have to tap out for it and just kind of cross your fingers and hope that you get to untap with it. The thing about the ring, and the reason it makes the thing that makes this card so powerful, is the built-in protection. You tap out for the ring, and then you're guaranteed that one extra turn to untap and get, you get that extra turn to utilize those extra cards that you're getting. The other thing that I think is exceptionally powerful about this card is it's actually better in multiples, even though it's a legendary card, because one of the things that you have to consider when you're playing with this card and activating it turn after turn after turn is every single time you activate it, you're taking more damage the following turn. But because the card, like, if you play a second copy and you kind of reset the burden counters, the second copy is actually arguably better than the first copy, so it kind of incentivizes you to just jam 4 copies of it into your deck. So that's kind of what the card does at a base level. As far as the format at large, now if you look at the Pro Tour top 8, there was 4 decks that featured 4 copies of the ring and 4 decks that featured 0 copies of the ring, so it was in exactly half of the Pro Tour top 8. 42% of the total decks at the tournament had the One Ring in it, and that is kind of a lot, like 42% of the format playing this card. That's definitely, somewhat of a red flag. So at the end of the day, if you want my kind of prediction, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if they banned this card, although the gameplay itself, it actually does kind of makes for some interesting back and forth, with the exception of, if it goes unanswered for multiple turns, then, it can kind of snowball and run away with the game. The one thing that I find interesting is ring versus ring. You're both kind of like drawing a bunch of cards and slogging back and forth, and maybe that's not a good explanation or a good example of why I think the cards may be potentially good or could stay in the format. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't be surprised if they ban it, but I'm not 100% convinced if it needs to go. But let me know what your thoughts on the ring in the comments below. Now, the next card or cards that I want to discuss here are the ones you see in front of you, the MH2 Elementals. Now, there is one specific card within these 5 that I think is the most likely to get the axe out of the 5, but I wanted to discuss them as a whole, because they are free spells at the end of the day. We've kind of seen Wizards' mistakes in the past with free spells, Gitaxian Probe, Mental Misstep, etc., etc. Now, these are not quite on the same power level as those, because these are, I guess Gitaxian Probe is not a defensive card, Mental Misstep is, but these are mostly, well, mostly I should say, purely defensive cards. The only thing that, with the exception of when you kind of mix in other cards like Feign Death, Undying Malice. Now, if you guys didn't know, Rakdos Scam did win the Empire Pro Tour. There were several games that we watched live on camera in the top 8 and throughout the weekend that just kind of felt like non-games. One player just had turn 1, Grief, pitch a black card, Undying Malice, take your 2 best cards. The reason that Grief specifically out of these 5, I think if you had to ask me which one of these, here's the thing. You told me that I could only ban one of these cards, that I had to ban one of them. Grief would be my answer. The thing that kind of bothers me about Grief, especially when combined with, again, Feign Death, Ephemerate, Undying Malice, etc., those kind of blink or, reanimate type effects, the reason that Grief is so powerful out of these is it's the most proactive option. And the thing that makes it even more harder to interact with than the other options is it takes away your 2 best cards. So imagine a scenario where you're playing some sort of interactive deck that has Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, whatever. Your opponent griefs you and Feign Deaths. They take your only 2 removal spells, and you're left with a bunch of creatures that mostly don't matter, maybe expensive cards. And Grief itself is not only a 5-turn clock after your 2 best cards just got hand ripped, but it also has Menace, so it's harder to interact with even on the battlefield in combat. So, Scam did win the Pro Tour. I think out of all of these cards that we're going to discuss today, I think Grief might be the most likely, or the one that I think is the most likely to get the axe out of any of these cards. The thing about Fury specifically, because Fury is also in the Scam deck. Now, Fury plus Feign Death is on turn 1, gives you a 4/4 double strike. Now, the thing about that is, yes, it's a faster clock, but you have your full starting hand to interact with it. If you have a removal spell, you can just kill it and move on with your life. If you have some way to if you can just race your opponent and kill them before the Fury kills you, that's fine. You got to keep all your cards. So I think of these, Grief is probably the most likely one to go. Not 100% certain that it needs to go. Again, Modern's in a weird spot because I don't really think anything necessarily has to get banned for the format's longevity and health. But if you want to spice things up a bit and maybe make some less non-games, I think Grief is probably a good place to start. Alright, here's one that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about, but I think it is worth bringing up given how many Cascade decks there were in the top 8. This is Violent Outburst. So, for those of you who don't know, the top 8 of the Modern Pro Tour featured 3 copies, yes, 3 copies of the Temur Rhinos deck, 0 copies of Living End, but Rhinos and Living End were amongst the top played decks at the Pro Tour. Violent Outburst has been on people's radar for Modern bans for quite some time right now. The instant speed nature of this really puts your opponent in a squeeze where they don't necessarily, at least with Shardless Agent, it's face up, you have to tap out, you can't also hold up interaction. This particular card plays extremely powerfully with Force of Negation because on your opponent's turn, you can Violent Outburst, cascade into your powerful free spell. If your opponent has a counterspell or some way to interact, you can Force of Negation back and then resolve your Rhinos or your Living End, what have you. I think 3 copies of this card, 12 copies, I guess, of this card in the top 8 is a decent amount, but not an alarming number. And I think the both representation and win rates of the various Cascade decks, I want to say they were somewhere in the mid-50s. I think Rhinos was about 55 and Living End was just above 50 at 51 in terms of win rates over the weekend. So not alarming win rates, but if you decided that you wanted to hit the Cascade decks, this is probably the card. It's really hard to hit the Cascade decks that in a meaningful way without completely rendering them unplayable. Either you hit the free spell, whether it's Crashing Footfalls or Living End, in which case the deck is literally unplayable, or you hit the most powerful Cascade spell, which I think makes the deck still unplayable. There are replacements. You could play Ardent Plead, Demonic Dread. There's plenty of other Cascade spells that you can play, but none of them are instant speed, and the colors on this one, specifically in the Rhinos deck, because this card pitches to both red cards with Fury and then green cards with Endurance and Force of Vigor. So, at the end of the day, As a fellow Rhinos player, I really hope that they don't touch this card, but it has been on people's radars for quite some time in terms of, whether this card should be banned, whether it should be legal, is it good for the format, is it healthy for the format. I think there are enough backstops to Cascade that it's the win rates of the Cascade decks are always going to be held in check by cards like Chalice the Void, Draenith Magistrate. There's plenty of, plethora of options out there. But I'm curious to see what you guys think on this one. That's all I got for now with discussion on the modern format specifically. I think the format's in relatively good shape. Now let's move on to a format that may not be in as good shape, and that's Pioneer. And we're going to start with the card you have on your screen, one of the most hotly contested cards in the format, alongside its brethren, Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. Replace this with any of the cards in the Green Devotion deck. I will be completely honest with you. There is a reason that I kind of switched to Modern, and it's not 100% due to the fact that Lord of the Rings came out. That obviously has some to do with it. I wanted to play with the new cards. But I'm going to be honest with you, I really have not been enjoying Pioneer over the past couple of months, and it's mostly due to this card and this deck, Mono Green Devotion. I really think that going with the format's longevity, I don't think it is sustainable to keep this deck at full power if you want to have a healthy and sustainable format. I really think that Karn puts, maybe not Karn specifically, but this is the card that I think most people talk about, but it really puts a damper on what you can actually do in the Pioneer format. This deck is extremely resilient. It has a lot of, it's very redundant, right? It has a lot of mana elves, it has a lot of payoffs, it has a lot of ways to bridge the gap with the 3-drops like Polukranos and Old Growth Troll, and like Cavalier of Thorns to bridge the mid game. It has an unbeatable late game, like Storm, Flashback Storm can just grind through any amount of counter spells. It has access to a plethora of cards that most decks would not even have access to in a game 1 setting with this exact card, Karn the Great Creator, fetching things like Damping Sphere, Tormod's Crypt, Pithing Needle, all these cards. And I just think it's kind of a gatekeeper. There's a lot of decks in the format that just you cannot show up to a Pioneer tournament if your deck, and expect to win the tournament if your deck has a bad mono green matchup. And, sometimes you could argue and say, well, you can just punt the matchup, et cetera, et cetera. But when this deck is, what is an average Pioneer tournament? What do you expect the metagame to be of mono green? Like somewhere between 30 and 35%? Is that the average? You can't, when a deck is 30 or 35% of the format, it's really hard to punt the matchup because you're just going to play against it a lot. And some people use the argument, well, it's very die roll and coin flippy. Yeah, but do you really want people deciding games on die rolls and coin flips? Not a big fan of that. So I think, personally speaking, and this might cause a lot of, discussion in the comments, which I'm always here for engagement, but I really, really do think that if you want to continue to push the format, the Pioneer format, to the masses, and they're clearly making this a supported, constructed format, given that we had back-to-back RC seasons, they're going to have another Pioneer Pro Tour, they really want to push this as a format, and it's eventually, who knows how long that's going to be, accessible fully on Arena. I really do think you need to do something about this deck, and personally speaking, I would probably axe this card. There's an argument to be made for Nykthos. There's maybe an argument to be made for other cards in the deck, but I personally would like to see this card go. And last but not least, we have to talk about maybe not the most dominant deck or the deck with the highest win percentage, but certainly the most played deck over the better part of the last year, and that is Rakdos Midrange. Now, I'm showcasing Fable the Mirror Breaker here because I think that is the card that has been in the most discussions about whether or not it should be banned. People have also suggested Thoughtseize, which I think you could make a case for, but I'm going to try and make the case for Fable here. Now, I will preface this by saying I don't actually think anything from Rakdos Midrange needs to be banned. I think over maybe the past couple of months, maybe 3-4 months, we've really seen, ever since the Pro Tour, we've really seen this decrease in the metagame percentage overall of Rakdos Midrange. I'm looking on Goldfish right now, and it's only the 5th most played deck, at 6.3% of the meta, which is less than half of what the mono green currently is at, a little over 13%. And there was a period of time, 4, 5, 6 months ago, where Rakdos Midrange was 20% of the metagame, 15%, and it was by far the most played deck. So that has certainly decreased, and to a point where I think it's fine for it to exist. Also, the thing about Fable the Mirror Breaker, I understand that it was banned in Standard, and I think that might be a lot of people's knee-jerk reactions where Pioneer is relatively close to Standard. It's like in between Standard and Modern. But you have to realize the power level of Pioneer is like 10 times more than what the power level of Standard is on average. You get to play cards like Thoughtseize, you get to play Fatal Push, you get to play all these like awesome 1 mana cards, and you get to play these busted combo decks like Lotus Field and Mono Green Devotion and Creativity and all this stuff. And a card like Fable the Mirror Breaker is obviously going to be omnipresent in terms of mid-range mirrors. Like, it's going to be the king of mid-range, and that's why we haven't seen a lot of other, true mid-range decks pop up in the format. Something like Golgari or maybe Jund or something like that, where, people feel kind of forced to put Fable into their deck in order to compete in these mid-range fights, and I get that argument. But I do think the card at the power level that Pioneer is, I think it's just about right, in terms of where it needs to be for the format. Like, the card does provide a lot of value, but there are some decks that just don't really care about that. There are decks that go under it. Like I said, Lotus Field, the hyper linear aggressive decks like Boros Convoke and Spirits and Humans, they largely don't care about Fable. So I'm kind of okay with it for now, especially given the win rates of Rakdos and the overall metagame share has significantly decreased over the past couple of months. And I think I'd be shocked if they banned something from Rakdos. And that, my friends, is going to do it for our ban list discussion episode. Remember, if you're watching this, which I should try to get this video at either Tuesday or Wednesday, it's going to be, the ban announcement that is going to be announced on Monday, August 7th, I believe. I think it's the 7th. And what I'll be doing is a live kind of reaction video to that. I'll actually record my live reaction and I'll upload that the Monday that the ban list comes out. At the end of the day, my predictions, again, not my wish list, but my predictions, what I think they're going to do. I think they will consider banning Ring. I think if I had to put a percentage on whether or not the Ring's going to get banned, I would kind of be leaning towards like 60-40 or 65-35 in favor of it actually getting banned. I think that out of Modern, I think that's the card that is most likely to go, and potentially Grief. I think I'd probably put Grief somewhere in that range as well. I think those are the two most problematic cards. That being said, I think Modern's in an okay spot. It could be a little bit better. I really wish that, the non-games from Grief didn't exist, but it is what it is. As far as Pioneer is concerned, I really, really strongly believe that they are going to ban something from Mono Green, because I'm going to be completely honest with you, if they don't, I'm probably not going to touch that format for a while again, or very sparingly, because whenever I make a video and I play against Mono Green 3 or 4 times, it's just not watchable content, let's be honest. So that's kind of where I'm at with Pioneer. I think they really should ban something from Mono Green, and then as far as Modern is concerned, like, again, 60-40 on the Ring, 60-40 on Grief, maybe one of those two could go. Be sure to let me know, this is the most important part of this video, let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. Would love to hear your takes on the ban list, what you guys think should be banned. Let me know how wrong I am about all of my opinions today, and I'll see you guys in the next one.